Welcome to the Daily Dharma, a gentle podcast where we read a philosophical story every week and reflect on how it relates to everyday life. Our focus is to use Buddhist philosophy to understand the complexity of modern life and find achievable and accessible pathways to peace. Hi everyone, welcome to the Daily Dharma. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the shadow self, what it is, and why it's important to accept as part of our full self. The story that we'll be reflecting on this theme is called The Emptiness, and it comes from the book Tiger, Mouse, Strawberry by Yuki Senda. Here is how the story goes. One day, a young but also somewhat arrogant man who was studying Zen came to Zen Master Hakko. With great eagerness to show his vast knowledge of Zen Buddhism, he said to the master, "Mind, Buddha, and all other living beings do not exist. The true nature of all phenomena is emptiness. Enlightenment does not exist, nor do legends, delusions, problems, and mediocrity exist. There is no such thing as giving, just as there is no such thing as taking." Hakko listened patiently to the student without saying a word. Then he clenched his bamboo staff between his fingers and suddenly struck the student's head. The young student let out a brief cry of pain and was visibly outraged by the Zen master's actions. The Zen master dryly asked him, "If nothing exists, where does your anger come from?" I really enjoy this story because this idea that everything is emptiness is slightly difficult to wrap my head around, and also something that is, for some reason, very common when it comes to the discourse of Buddhist philosophy, and in particular Zen philosophy. And I would like to say that I believe it is a very bad misinterpretation of what happiness, or I would say the lack of suffering, is supposed to be. Because theoretically, after you feel at peace with yourself, there are less thoughts, there are less pressing emotions. There is ultimately a lot more quiet within yourself. But emptiness, especially in the English language, carries with it this void, this lack of anything that I think it's not the right word to really describe the quiet that we feel within ourselves when we've actually been able to resolve the conflicts within us. And it really makes me smile and laugh to think of the Zen master just flicking a little stick at this man's head and essentially questioning him on his own philosophy of emptiness. Because if everything is indeed emptiness, where does anger come from? And I do think that, unfortunately, a lot of spiritual mumbo jumbo can begin with denial, with this sense of, well, if you don't choose to say that you're unhappy, if you don't choose to acknowledge that you're unhappy, well, the unhappiness isn't there. And this is so distressing to the person who is dealing with this unhappiness, because it's like the elephant in the room. How can you ignore something that is clearly there? Now, we may not know what it is, and we may not know the extent to which this bothers the person, but denial and denying the existence of what is clearly a felt emotion or experience only leads to more stress. And I don't think that, at least in my experience and for me, this is why when I read or I hear about this whole idea that, well, Zen Buddhism is about emptiness, it just frustrates me because if we are emptiness, well, then how does that explain everything that's within us? I think just like the master is pointing to in the story, so much of what our practice is acceptance of the different emotions, experiences, good, bad, everything in between that we go through. Because a lot of the stress and the frustration comes from denial or from anger at having those parts of ourselves, what we like to call the shadow self, that we don't want to acknowledge. And anger in particular is very often a symptom of the shadow self, because what I like to call the shadow self, and it's, very common term in psychology, is it's the part of you that you want to repress, you want to hide away because it's ugly, it's animalistic, it has far more primitive intentions and impulses than you are really willing to show in polite society amongst even your friends and family. But what I find so fascinating about each of our shadow selves, the parts of us that we want to hide, is how revealing they are about the life that we've lived. I would say my shadow self is very reactive, very angry, but really very, very scared, because it comes from that part in my life where I didn't have very much control as a child, and I felt that being angry was my only defense mechanism. And it has kicked in, especially during times of high stress or when I feel threatened. But the difference now is, as an adult, I can recognize this shadow self coming to life. And I don't need to essentially put myself down and think, oh, this is a bad part of myself. I need to take it away. I need to cut it out of me. I need to get rid of it. No, I want to look at that shadow self and say, thank you for being here. I know who you are. I know where you come from. But just so you know, I know we're feeling threatened, but it'll pass. And there are much more easier ways to feel safer and to face the problem than to simply become angry and defensive about what's going on. And I think that really is the great privilege of having the time and space and distance from when and where our shadow selves came to be, the parts of us that, we are essentially inclined to hide, and now, which is having time to have reflected on all the different versions and parts of ourselves, and to actually have that mental capacity and distance to speak to those versions and to parts of ourselves and to say, you know what? I know that you're there, and I thank you for being there when I needed you, but I think I have the capacity and the bandwidth to approach this in a different way, to approach this problem not with pure animalistic rage and anger, but with patience and with compassion, with understanding. But I think the interesting thing is that if we really want to exercise patience with others and with life, we also need to exercise that patience first and foremost with ourselves. And the thing is that as much as we can pretend to be patient with others, if we can't show that same level of consideration and patience towards the versions of ourselves that are difficult, that do feel unmanageable and untamable, well, then the patience or the practice of patience can never be complete within us. But when you allow yourself to speak kindly to these parts of ourselves, often affected by trauma, often affected by negative, adverse experiences that we struggle to get through, then we know just how powerful and important patience is. And we actually feel like practicing it more in other aspects of our lives. So there's so much more I can express about the shadow self and its usual ties to the anger and the frustration in our lives. But I think the most important thing to remember is that any version, any part of you, including the shadow self, is you. And thus, it also deserves the same level of patience, of compassion, and of dignity, like the other aspects of yourself. And even when it rears its ugly head and makes your life difficult, if we recognize that, well, there is a reason why this version of ourselves exists, and we have to respect that reason, it becomes a lot easier to simply be with this part of ourselves without being frustrated at why it's there and why it's bothering us. And we begin to understand just how complex we really are and how diverse our life has been, but also how far we've come, that now we can slowly grow to be at peace with even our shadow self. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you have any questions or thoughts you'd like to share, please email me anytime at dailydharmapodcast@gmail.com. And may you have a beautiful, safe, and joyful week ahead of you. Until next week.